Hey guys, welcome and thank you so much for tuning in to this edition of Let's Be Blunt with Montel. I've been doing this podcast now for almost a year and a half, and we've got well over a couple hundred episodes now. And one of the most asked questions that I get from people outside of the podcast is that, thank you so much for say, thank you so much for all the information that you give us, during the podcast, especially about, how to navigate a dispensary if I get there. But I've always wondered, how can I trust the product that I'm getting? And I say to them, well, make sure it has a valid COA, and make sure that, the product has been tested. I mean, that's the one thing you have to make sure it's been tested. And then people come back and say, well, how can I, guarantee that when they say they've tested it, it's really truly tested? I said, well, most states are requiring testing now, though there are a few that have not made that mandatory yet. We're working hard to make sure that that gets changed in every state across the country. But most of the states have adopted, and most of the facilities or testing companies have adopted some standards that my guests today really are the people who are responsible for those standards. So let's ask those questions to them. My guests today have a background in cannabis and the cannabis industry spanning over 15 years and covering everything from regulatory compliance to research and development to product testing. In 2010, they opened Science of Cannabis labs in Capitola, California, and developed the industry's first testing standards. These guidelines are now being widely adopted by cannabis community regulators and governments and many organizations all over the country. They're here to discuss some of the industry's pros and cons and what consumers should know when choosing a cannabis product. Jeff Gray, Josh Wurzer, thank you so much for being a part of Let's Be Blunt with Montel, sir. Gentlemen.
Thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, you were both working in the cannabis industry way back before it was vogue, when it was really difficult back then to navigate, the landscape, and way more difficult than it is today. How did you both get involved in cannabis, and to begin with? Let's start with you, Jeff. How did you get involved in cannabis?
Man, I've been in cannabis since right out of high school, really. I live in a space where cannabis in some sense has been decriminalized within the city. And I grew up in a place called Santa Cruz, California. And the cannabis industry, I mean, when we talk about the industry, sometimes we frame it within like the movement to the industry. And, we were there early on in the movement. I'm 50 years old now. And, that gives me 30 plus years in that. I've participated at a lot of different levels. I was a cultivator. I would do consulting. I worked with early dispensaries. And, I think one of the things is I came into this sector of the industry basically because I sat down with my partner and two of my other partners over a beer one night, and they blew my mind about what was possible, what I was missing, having been in cannabis for 20 plus years. I didn't. There's so many things I didn't understand. That there's such a science to this, and we've been testing, running a laboratory ever since.
Wow. And how about you, Josh? What was your introduction to cannabis?
Yeah, so I'm from Wisconsin originally, so we did not have the same kind of atmosphere for cannabis as existed out in California. But I was always a fan of the plant. I was always sort of science minded, and I always thought cannabis held a lot more potential than sort of a lot of the other kind of recreational drugs that I saw around me, some legal, some illegal. And so when I moved out to California after graduating from college, I graduated with a chemistry degree. It was both kind of to begin my career, but also to kind of pursue the cannabis industry on the side. And so I was working in sort of mainstream chemistry jobs in the pharmaceutical industry and the electronic materials industry, and but I always had to grow on the side living out here. And so kind of on a lark one day, I took a job interview just because I'd been kind of looking at new jobs and saw an advertisement for a lab director. And the very end, it said, must be comfortable working with medical marijuana. And nothing, nothing like we have now existed back then. And so I just took filled out my resume, sent it in because I wanted to go see what they're up to. And that ended up being the first cannabis testing lab, anywhere that would test for the medical marijuana industry. So I was the lab director there, and I ended up getting a job. Said, okay, well, I'll take the job. Um, not happy where I'm at right now. I'll keep looking for something else. Obviously, I'll never put this on my resume because it's career suicide. And a year later, I was really digging it, and that's when I thought, hey, this is a great idea, but I think the cannabis industry needs something that's a little bit closer to what I see in the food testing industry. I see in the environmental testing industry, and I think we could do a better job. And so that's kind of where Jeff came in, and I pitched the idea to him, and we had a couple other partners that came in on it, and so we started SC Labs, and that was 12 years ago today. And my angle, sort of from the beginning, Jeff had an economics degree, and he's much more business minded than me, so he ran the business side of things, and I ran the laboratory side of things, and 12 years later, here we are.
Well, let's go back though. 12 years ago, I mean, the industry kind of looked a little bit sideways at you guys that were claiming to, or back then, telling people that you had the ability to test a product. There was a lot of anxiety in the industry about that, was there not?
Absolutely. I mean, I think like even today, there's an evolving set of standards, both safety and quality, in terms of cannabis. And I think early days, the standards are most basically a set of agreements. There are two main drivers normally, and they're industry drivers and they're regulatory drivers. And so, and in the best instances, they work together. So, you know, um, early
And back
on,
in the beginning, they weren't working together.
they
I
were
can
not.
remember, like you guys have been in this business for 15 years. I've been in this business now for close to 20. As a matter of fact, was one of the first people like, to kind of jumped outside and went public back in 2001 about my cannabis use, which was met with, just pushback from everybody and their mother. And, but I also remember back then trying to start a business around cannabis and started producing products and getting them tested. And you would send them out, and I guarantee you got back three different test results from three different laboratories, which was really kind of crazy. I mean, I couldn't understand why we're doing this scientifically, why we didn't get the same numbers. I would look at three COAs and the numbers would be skewed, you know? So your processes have seemed to have jumped to the fore now. Most people are following your standards. Back then, though, I mean, and even nowadays, I mean, there are several states that don't have really consistent testing within the states. And so, how did you convince the early subscribers back in California that your standards were better than others?
Well, so that's a loaded question. So yeah, back then it was sort of the Wild West. None of the laboratories had any type of regulatory requirements on them. None of them, were accredited to any type of standards. So it was sort of you were sort of at the mercy of whichever lab you chose to work with, whether or not they had kind of the scientific rigor to really give accurate results. And there were a lot of really good labs that started out right away. We certainly weren't the only ones that were trying to do it right. But then there were a lot of labs that were just, sort of marketing vehicles for different dispensaries, and were just giving people numbers they wanted. But really early on, and back then it was still the medical program. So we were looking at kind of everything as medicine, and our mindset was, what good does telling people what they want to hear do us? I mean, all we have is sort of, we give people numbers on a piece of paper, and if we don't have some sort of scientific rigor behind those numbers, what do we have then as a business? And so, early on, we kind of committed to to doing things the right way, and to developing and validating methods that properly. And I think we also had some really early industry backers like Weed Maps that kind of put their support behind us. And so I think, yeah, early on, before regulations came in and before there were any requirements in the labs, we tried to hold ourselves up as sort of the lab that was doing things the right way, and I think we did. And we were certainly the first lab to offer a lot of tests, like a true pesticide test. We were the first lab to do residual solvent and residual chemical testing and concentrates. So we sort of we sort of evolved with the industry in California, having been around so long. I mean, like you said, 20 years you've been in it. We've been in it, a- as individuals much longer than 12 years, but we've been in it since 2010. So, in the cannabis industry, that's a lifetime. And so we've seen it kind of evolve. And now you have, states that are requiring it. They do look into the laboratories. They do require us to have accreditations, and there's still, the lab testing industry still isn't perfect, but it's certainly evolved and come a long ways. But yeah, the early days, it was tough, and it was sort of, were you going to work with laboratories that were doing it the right way, or were you going to go searching for laboratories that give you the numbers you want?
Right. And along the way, I mean, this industry has definitely grown up and evolved. I mean, very in the very beginning, you were testing for what, and then now, what are you testing for?
Well, I mean, early on, the first tests we were doing were cannabinoids, and so, it makes sense. Those are the active ingredients in cannabis: THC, CBD, CBN. And early on, it was just those three. We couldn't even get analytical standards for any of the other cannabinoids. And over the years, that's evolved as, as different, standards makers, where we're getting standard analytical standards that we could test, and as we sort of added things to that test. But, and if anything, early on, maybe the one disservice the cannabis industry has done to the cannabis plant in general is that, became early on, well, since you're only testing for cannabinoids, a higher cannabinoid, the higher the THC, the better the cannabis, and that just definitely isn't the case, right? And so, but then over the years we started testing for terpenes, which are sort of the aromatic and flavor compounds in cannabis, and then we started testing for contaminants like pesticides, residual solvents, heavy metals, things of that nature.
And a lot of that, I mean, back to the earlier question, so much of that was informed by our experience with cannabis and our partnerships with people in the industry who are always sort of the good actors, right? I mean, there were people in the industry driving, dispensaries, advocates for patient groups who were driving access. It wasn't just access, safe access. It was safe access to safe medicine, right? And so I think for those people who were truly in cannabis. So for an example, like the early pesticide tests we did, we had been cultivators. We knew a lot of cultivators. We were testing for those things that people were using. Is those sort of agreements where you say, well, this test holds water versus testing for things that people aren't using and everybody passes, right? Which was some of the, right, again, it's back to an evolving set of standards and those standards being informed by actual practice. Right?
Gotcha. Well, what are some of the main concerns that you're seeing now in what you're testing? I mean, I know you test for pesticides, molds, heavy metals, but what are some of the other things that you're concerned about right now in product that you share?
Well, it's interesting. So we do a lot of cannabis testing. We do a lot of hemp testing, and you've been in this for a long time, right? X amount of years ago, they're the same thing, right?
Of
It's
course.
type 1, type 2, type 3 cannabis. And so what's interesting though is the application of a totally different set of standards to cannabis than hemp. So hemp is all over the place. A lot of states don't have anything in place. It can cross state lines, right? I mean, people are looking for federal guidance, and federal guidance is slow in every instance with anything to do with cannabis. But with cannabis, what you're seeing is you're also seeing a difference in particular states, and sometimes that it it affects people's belief that what you're testing for really is a safe product. It's 106 pesticides on a hemp panel in Colorado. It's 40 something in Oregon. It's 60 something in California. Why are certain pesticides not, why would certain pesticides not put people at risk in California that they would in Colorado, right? So obviously there's still work to do, but we see, I think one of the most interesting things is not, I think, cannabis that you see in dispensaries is some of the safest product that you put in or on your body. And the reason I say that is because the standards that are in place in the state of California specific to cannabis, I mean, I'd walk into an organic grocery store and fail most everything on the shelf, right? According to those standards, where they're so low and they're so hard to meet. And I think it's because it's for a number of reasons. It's for consumer protection, but there's also a little bit of a bias. We have to do everything twice as good because we were that illicit market for so long. And so, I actually think from a safety concern, I think actually cannabis is an incredibly safe product within the supply chain of the regulated market. Now, I think the biggest problem we're seeing is the sort of manipulation of quality standards around, cannabinoids and terpenes. Because truly, if you want to get down to it, we're talking about dosage. And
Right.
cannabis is being sold as if THC equates to price. THC doesn't even equate to quality, right? I mean, truly, it's dosage, but it's such a complicated product that what we've done is we've sort of oversimplified that to the point that it's almost like Everclear is the best alcohol ever made because it's the most potent, which isn't the truth, right? It's the same thing for cannabis. So we've got this beautiful product that has so much value in can be so specific to people's ailments, to even to recreational users. But that oversimplification, I think that's probably the biggest issue that I see in the application of the results that we give out.
And I also find it interesting that, though the results like I actually have a product that's in the marketplace in Boston or in the Massachusetts area, and the state of Massachusetts requires, like our vape pen, our oil has to be tested once it's completely produced. Then once it's put into the cart, it has to be tested again.
Mhm.
Make sure that it's not leaching out any, metals or anything from the particular cart that you're using. So, and every state seems to have their own rules. When do you think we're going to come up with some sort of a master plan for all states that have legal cannabis?
I think we're working in that direction. Certainly for us, it's definitely Manny. We have someone kind of spending pretty much almost full time job, just tracking different regulations in states and trying to keep up to date. Like Jeff mentioned, we're testing hemp in all 50 states, so we have to test to a different standard depending on where this hemp is going to be sold and where it's being produced. And in cannabis, the same way. Obviously, in cannabis, we can't cross state lines with the high THC cannabis. So we don't necessarily aren't have to be as concerned with the state by state cannabis regulations in states where we don't operate. But I think you're starting to see that coalesce. I think each state that comes online sort of builds on what came previously. And then a lot of them want to add, there one or two little extras to the regulations just to make things difficult. But we're seeing some of the state regulators start to get together, at least have a dialogue on kind of what makes sense. Cannabis, like Jeff said, is such a hard product to regulate because there's nothing kind of that you can draw an exact corollary to. It's you could look at food, but food isn't generally inhaled. So a lot of the contaminants or toxins that can be found in food, don't necessarily apply one to one with cannabis because they enter your body differently. They have a different risk profile because they're inhaled rather than consumed. You could look at cigarettes, but cigarettes are kind of grossly underregulated, and in sort of most jurisdictions take the kind of stance, and certainly the federal government takes a stance that you're already kind of taking a health risk by consuming cigarettes anyways. So a lot of the contaminants that are found on cigarettes aren't regulated like they are with cannabis.
Yeah, I find that really kind of crazy that they won't go back now and say to cigarette manufacturers, you need to have a COA tag attached to the outside of your cigarette pack. I mean, people should know what it is they're putting in their body.
Certainly. And then like Jeff said, like food, even organic food, about 3% of the organic food is, actually even inspected per year, and much less is tested. And then there's allowances for pesticides due to drift and things like that. So there's just every kind of regulator that's trying to tackle this cannabis problem is sort of starting from scratch. And they're doing it state by state, whereas normally the feds would jump in and sort of give states direction, and they have much more resources to establish quality and purity guidelines, and normally that wouldn't be handled as at that level by the states. Certainly we can look at alcohol, which is regulated state by state or even county by county, but the quality and purity standards for alcohol is overseen by the federal government. And so we're starting to see some kind of movement on the federal government. The United States Pharmacopoeia Convention, which sets kind of quality and purity guidelines for a lot of nutraceuticals and drug products, and which their standards sort of become the federal standard. Then at that point, is starting to look at cannabis. I actually am on a working group with the USP. We published a monograph for cannabis last year. It wasn't able to be published in the standard pharmacopoeia, but we published it in a journal in preparation for when the politics allow for it to be published in the national standard. Now we're working on CBD and hemp products. So I think hemp might lead the way in this regard, but the FDA isn't even weighing in on hemp either. So I think
And hemp, and a lot of people don't understand, that they've been using hemp over in Chernobyl for the last 20 years to help leach some of the radioactive materials up out of the soil. And the cannabis plant is the exact same plant when it comes to its ability to leach things out of soil. So, I mean, do you think that we should be setting higher standards for hemp than cannabis? It's weird, but you know,
Well, we should be setting standards for hemp. So right now that in hemp is the exact same thing as cannabis. Hemp is just cannabis that produces more CBD and less THC, whereas the kind of standard drug type cannabis that we've been consuming for years tends to be high in THC, but there's also plenty of cannabis that's high in CBD that would be considered hemp in the medical market. But the problem is in all these states that are allowing medical marijuana or cannabis, high THC cannabis, they're very strictly regulating it. But then a lot of these states, the same states, are kind of allowing hemp products to kind of just enter the market wholly unregulated. So it's also creating this sort of kind of barrier entry for people who want to produce high THC cannabis that doesn't have to be met by the hemp producers. And so that's a big issue too. But I agree with you. I think hemp should be regulated at least to the level that high THC cannabis is, and certainly then also with hemp we have sort of all of these people producing psychoactive substances from the CBD and hemp and sort of getting around the requirements for high THC cannabis by taking CBD and basically performing chemical reactions on it to make different forms of THC that can get you high.
I don't know if that's going to last much longer. I just think that's probably one of the things that this industry needs to police itself over. I mean, there's a lot of things that we do wrong. I think we spend a lot of time, casting aspersions at the federal government or local state governments, and then we still sit down and allow our compadres in this business to run amok. I mean, I really believe that the production of THC8 and THCO is just waiting for the Fed to have an excuse to come in and slap you upside your head.
Yeah, absolutely.
And some of the chemicals that are used, I guess, is for THCO. Aren't some of the chemicals that are used for that? Are they testing that product the same way that they would test a high THC product or a CBD product? Are they really testing those things?
Not
Not
at all.
none.
Yeah, I mean, like Josh said, there's not really because there's no federal standard. You can be, so there's the setting of the standard, and then there's the enforcing the standard. So right, and that's a whole different thing. But in terms of setting a standard, I mean, these can be produced anywhere and shipped anywhere, right, across state lines, and like it's a workaround. So there's no, a lot of these are wholly untested, being distributed in spaces that aren't. Again, it reminds me, early on in cannabis, there were people who were testing to whatever standard, the highest standard they could find. Right? There are currently national distributors. Whole Foods is carrying CBD products, and the panel that they test their products to is a national comprehensive standard that meets the criteria for all 50 states or all 46 states that they're distributed in, right? So there are definitely those people pushing the envelope, and then there are those like you're talking about that always, right? It always seemed to like draw the focus of the federal government or for those people who want to call us out for not being the industry that we truly are, which is progressive, which is compassionate, which is enlightened. Like it's a really interesting space. I'm not. My feeling is enforcement has been probably more destructive than the lack of standards. So you have that balance, but at the same time, consumers, patients, whomever need the information, they need access to.
What do you think consumers should be most aware of when they're choosing a cannabis product? You did say, I mean, that you think that the products that are in most dispensaries are at least tested to a standard that I think most consumers could feel comfortable with, correct?
In California, yeah, California's panel is significant. Certain states, I believe Washington is only doing cannabinoids and microbiology. There's a lot left there, or at least they were at some point, and then they could be progressing. So, but yeah, I think yeah, at least there's some traceability. There's a chain of custody, and there's more accountability than in that system than there is outside of that system.
But you just hit it. I mean, we have what 37 states in the District of Columbia now that have a legal cannabis program with THC, and then we have 46 states that allow for CBD. I mean, what should and my podcast is viewed by people all over the world. So, just if you had to suggest something that somebody would say, look, when you look at your COA, make sure that it has a COA. Some products don't even come with that.
Yeah, and I think so. So, and like I kind of alluded to earlier, and Jeff was talking about as well, is you don't choose wine by the alcohol content, and that's the analogy that gets used all the time. But THC is not the quality indicator of cannabis, especially for inhalable cannabis. For edible products, yeah, you want to have an accurate dosage. That's what I'm looking for, is a COA from a reputable lab, so I can get an accurate dosage on an edible product. Because once I eat it, it's kind of too late to take less, right? And it takes a while for orally consumed cannabis to kick in. So if you consume too much, you're sort of in for a bad experience potentially.
Yes.
But with inhalable cannabis, it's 100% the terpenes and not the cannabinoids, because whether my cannabis has 10% THC or 30% THC, I'm exhaling like 90 some% of that THC anyways. So I can hold it in a little bit longer if I want to get a little bit stronger of effect. But what I'm going for as a connoisseur of cannabis, I'm going for that flavor. I'm going for maybe that unique effect that one variety or strain of cannabis gives me over the other. And what I'm looking for there is the terpene content, the overall terpene content, to tell me how much of a flavor it's going to have, and then the specific terpenes. And the terpenes are the aromatic compounds that make up the essential oil of cannabis and make up the essential oil of most kind of fragrant plants. Like flowers. Pine scent is alpha pinene and beta pinene and some terpinolene is so there's these different terpenes are created by many plants, and they give cannabis the flavor and aroma. And so that is what's making a really tasty, flavorful cannabis tasty and flavorful is the terpene content. And it also, the terpenes, many of them are bioactive in their own right, so they're what give cannabis sort of the kind of unique effects from one strain to another. For instance, I can consume a 15% THC strain and get really sleepy and kind of relaxed, and I can consume another 15% THC strain and sort of have more of a kind of an energetic high, and kind of what people would say more inspiring. And a lot of times that just comes down to the myrcene content of the cannabis. Myrcene is a terpene, and it's a relatively potent sedative when inhaled. And so strains that are predominantly high in myrcene as for the terpene are what are generally or traditionally considered indica strains, and they make you a little sleepier. And that's not the cannabinoids, that's the myrcene that's also in there. And then strains that lack myrcene tend to not have that sedative effect, and those are what we've traditionally called sativas. And so I think really, if people want to know the kind of the quality, the quantitative quality indicator of cannabis, they should look at the terpene content and sort of ignore the THC content.
Yeah, it's very interesting. I've been producing a product now for close to 15 years. I was one of the first people to actually put together a product in a vape pen that was both THC, CBD, and a unique terpene profile for each variation of the product that I have. A product out right now that's called Inspire in the Massachusetts area, and I put it out under Select, but it was by Montel. And the product that I had out, I have 5 or 6 different terpene formulations that I use depending on the time of the day and depending on the response that I'm trying to elicit from the product. So, and I've been doing this now for close to 15 years, long before people thought I was crazy. And I kept saying, no, guys, I'm telling you, it's just as important, the terpene profile, as the amount of THC. Because I can remember what always made me think that was that I can remember smoking cannabis back in 1971, 72, 73, and getting higher than I've ever been on some of the stuff that's considered, high THC content. Back then, the THC was probably no more than 11 or 12%. So wait a minute, how was I getting that kind of a euphoria on 11 or 12% when now it takes me to get that same kind of a feeling? I think about it, I think I have to be somewhere in the mid 20s with THC. And now that's stupid, because I shouldn't have to consume that much, or it shouldn't have to be that way.
And a lot of those really good strains from back then have gone away because they don't test high enough in THC, and no one wants to produce them anymore. They can't sell them, but they had a lot of value. They were very flavorful. They had really unique effects, but they they become extinct just because they don't test 25% or higher in THC.
Yeah, a lot of people don't know that we are responsible. We as a country are responsible for trying our best back in the 60s and early 70s to grow the CBD out of the plant, which was really kind of ridiculous. And now all of a sudden everybody's jumping on a bandwagon trying to grow it back into the plant. Right?
Yeah,
So I
and
think
even
it's a,
other cannabinoids too, as well as CBD, and then and so maybe I should have said that as well as maybe besides THC, another thing you could look at on a COA is, does it have unique cannabinoids? Does it have a little bit of CBD in there to sort of potentiate that effect? Maybe it'll have CBC or CBG or some of these other cannabinoids that are also very interesting, both both for kind of clinical purposes and just for even for recreational users.
absolutely. But now, if you were to do you think that the way that the products are, I guess the COA that appears on a box for the consumer, do you think that's friendly enough and easily understandable?
Yeah, yeah. I mean, the short answer is no, right? I mean, we've been for the 12 years that we've been in business, we've been trying to create, not a certificate of analysis, but a way that people can understand the data that we're giving them, right? Information is only valuable if people can comprehend what they're looking at. And so
Right.
I think there's probably two sides to that. One is education, making sure that people become make more educated choices. And the other is
Which I've got to tell you, I've said on this podcast for the last year and a half, and I'll say it over and over again. That's what we as an industry do the worst at, I believe. Honestly,
Mhm.
we do a great job B2B. You look at all the conventions that take place across the country, and at the end of the day, they are all B2B bullshit conventions. So there's a room full of vendors trying to hawk a brand new product, a brand new extraction technique, a brand new package, a brand new box. There's nobody there B2C in it, giving the information to the consumer to make the consumer feel more comfortable. I think until we start doing that, this industry is going to have a really hard time, because the consumer, just like the pharmaceutical industry, realized this 20 years ago, 30 years ago. That's why you see every time you turn on the television, you see a commercial for a new drug. Why? They are educating the public, so the public walks into the doctor's office and says, "Did you hear about this here?" And the doctor says, "No, I never heard about that." And next thing the doctor's looking it up, and you get a kickback from the people, and they serve the drug. I'm not saying that that's what we need to trick our industry into, but we need to make our consumers intelligent enough and knowledgeable enough and informed enough so that when they go into a dispensary, they can make a good conscious decision, or they can make a good conscious decision to just even walk in. I mean, you look at the way they do it in Israel. I mean, close to 14 years ago, 12 years ago, uh, Israel almost basically declared cannabis a geriatric drug and started educating senior citizens. As they turn the age of 70, you can walk into any dispensary, or no, sorry, walk into any hospital in Israel and get a prescription filled or get a bag of cannabis handed over to you, because they've recognized all of the other drugs that cannabis can replace for aging citizens. And so they provide that. And along with that, they provide brochures. It's easier to get information and have a discussion about what's in cannabis there than it is here. But here, we don't even spend the time in most dispensaries. I mean, they're trying their best. You said it almost yourself. When people walk in, they think that they're talking to somebody who's knowledgeable. They're talking to some bartender who's trying to sell them the highest THC thing they got on the block, which is
No,
really counterintuitive to what this industry needs to do to sustain itself.
I couldn't agree more. Absolutely. We for the consumer, what we do is branding, not education. And focusing on that education is incredibly important. We put a lot of energy into that, because we also believe in the product. We believe in cannabis, believe in the industry. I think one of the, it's interesting to see other industries that might draw parallels to, like wine, for instance. For whatever reason, I have no background of wine, but I can go into a restaurant and order off a wine menu, and I have a pretty good sense of what's what. Right? I think most people who smoke cannabis, much more than I drink wine, can walk into a dispensary, and all they can do is order based off a silly name or THC content.
And not knowing that the silly name may be the same name that they got in Southern California and Northern California, but it's not the same product.
Absolutely.
Grown by two different
Yeah.
growers, and they just
Yep.
stuck the name on a seed, and the seed, depending on how, it's all about, when you talk about wine or you talk about food, it's all about the hands. You know what I mean? I can go to one Italian restaurant and eat the lasagna, and go to the one next door and have the best lasagna I've ever had in my life. Why? It's the same product. It's noodles and sauce and some sort of meat. Maybe it could be vegan, but it's the same constituents. But the hands that actually did it made the difference. And a lot of times I think consumers don't understand that, I'm going to go get me some OG Kush here in San Francisco because I really enjoyed the OG Kush that I had in LA. Psh, it's a different product.
Yeah.
Could be different entirely. And then, we take a look at what's going on now in the vape, in the card industry. And people just are trying their damnedest to put a higher isolate with more and more THC on top of another isolate that had more and more THC, and not even recognizing that they're giving out stuff that just tastes terrible and doesn't have the secondary. A lot of people don't know that, terpenes have been around long before we started talking about cannabis. They test terpenes in olives. They test terpenes in tomatoes. And, myrcene is available. It's in mangoes. Is it the same? I would argue that somewhere along the way, as we start to research even more, we're going to notice that the myrcene in a mango isn't the exact same myrcene that's in cannabis. That's my argument. I don't know. You could tell me I'm wrong, but I think molecularly, I bet you that you'll find one O different somewhere along the way.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, and then we also have, people starting to put kind of these artificial flavors in these distillates as well too, or
I
not.
think that's absolute. I think that should be banned, outlawed. Excuse me. The product that I'm producing in Massachusetts, we use complete hemp or cannabis terpenes. I do not believe that I should be smoking an orange. Sorry.
Yep.
And I don't believe I should be smoking a grape, or putting a grape in my lungs. So, and I don't want to do that to the people who are following me. So I made sure that, and this has been since day one, I kind of tried my best to demand from the very first day that I got in this business that any terpenes that will be used will be 100% cannabis terpenes.
Or even worse, the grape flavor they put in bubble gum.
Right.
And it goes back to this kind of thing. A lot of things that people can eat are not things that you can burn and then inhale into your lungs. It's very
Yeah,
different.
and I agree. And I don't have an edible in the marketplace right now, but what I do, I will have gummies back in the marketplace here very soon. But I don't have a problem with using food-based terpenes in edibles, some of which I think will prove over time to be more bioavailable that way than the cannabis ones, the hemp ones. But then again, hemp-based terpenes or cannabis-based terpenes have a bioavailability in an edible form. Anyway, if we go back to the late 1500s, early 1600s, the majority of people on this planet consumed, not on the planet, but here in the United States and in Europe, consumed a hemp seed-based porridge. Why? Because they recognized that hemp seeds had more higher level of protein than any other seed that they had come across. And so, during those periods of time before you shot a deer on Monday and didn't get another deer until Thursday, Friday, you were getting some protein on Tuesday, Wednesday, just by eating that hemp porridge. Sailors used to eat hemp porridge on the oceans. So
Yep.
we know that terpenes in hemp are bioavailable ingested, but I'm not necessarily sure, again, if that's the same thing.
Well, yeah, and so like all these terpenes, a lot of them, and kind of not getting too deep in the chemistry, but they have different places where it's sort of like a left hand and a right hand, and it's they're both hands, but they're going to fit into different gloves, and that's how chemicals and then also our receptors in our body work. Is that chemicals can be right-handed and left-handed, and they can be right-handed and left-handed in many different places, and then your receptors in your body tend to depending on what part of the chemical is binding to that receptor, are like gloves. Only the right-handed molecule is going to fit in the right-handed glove. So cannabis is going to make these terpenes and different chemicals in a very specific shape, or either right-handed or left-handed. And so if you try and take a left-handed chemical that was either produced in a lab or maybe produced in some sort of other plant, using some sort of other biosynthetic pathway, it's not going to fit the same way in your body's receptors is maybe that cannabis molecule is that is meant for the right-handed glove, if that makes sense. That's kind of the best.
Absolutely.
But yeah, you're absolutely right. That's how it works.
Have you guys considered, from your lab, putting out a book to educate the consumer on terpenes and on all the various constituent parts of the plant? Have you considered that? Because I would say, so I think that would be well received, especially coming from a lab.
Actually, we're one of the books we yes, we considered something absolutely like that. There's something called the Emerald Cup in Northern California. They're putting together an almanac that would include a lot of the test results. It's interesting. We started testing for them. They're actually our very first client. Even before we had a lab space, we were testing the products that were entered in the Emerald Cup. And it used to be a very different type of format, right? I mean, it was the OG growers coming out of the hills type of deal with some land raised strains, some really amazing variety of things. And what we saw over time is that it's one of the places where we've been able to see that among the judges, some of the greatest cannabis connoisseurs in the world are coming together. They're judging this context, and what you're seeing is that there's really no difference in THC content between those that win and those that lose. It's all terpene content, right? And we draw that correlation statistically. And I think it's a really it's a really insightful thing that we can see both. I mean, that education needs to be there because we're obviously there's some de-learning that needs to happen, as well as some education. And so I think it's a great point. We've been educating. I mean, we do bud tender trainings, right? To your point, a lot of times the bud tender is seen almost as the sommelier in the space, or as if they have some sort of an extensive background. And most of the time, the bud tender may be sort of the lowest paid, least educated employee at that particular dispensary, right? Unfortunately, what that means is that they're giving, they've sort of been bestowed this credibility that they really shouldn't have. It's not
Correct.
true in all cases, but it's definitely true in some. And I think there you're right. I mean, education from us, it's been something that we've pushed and promoted for a long time, really having nothing to do with the lab specifically, but being able, for consumers to be able to make better choices.
Well, I would bet you that if in fact the Emerald Cup was going to put out some sort of a almanac kind of thing, okay, but I would have personally prefer to see it coming from your lab, not from the Emerald Cup, because I think they're
Yeah.
going to try to interpret something that they were told, and rather than have knowledge based in like you do. So I mean, that should be something you guys ought to think about and consider. I will bet you that it'll be well received. I recently received something called the clinical application for cannabis and cannabinoids that Normal put out, which is a book that identifies a lot of the maladies that seem to be affected by cannabis, but also in there has a bibliography page of we know that there have been well over 35,000 peer-reviewed study documents published in the last 10 years on cannabis, 3,500 of them in the last 2 years, more than any other drug on the planet researched. And at least that book from Normal references some of those things, so you can go and look them up. But I mean, I think that the most important thing right now is trying to educate the consumer and make consumer understand that they have options. And I think coming from a lab like yours would go a long way.
Yeah, and we do have like white papers and blog posts and a lot of information on at sclabs.com or website. And I
Say that
definitely
out again. Say that again. Say that again. Website.
sclabs.com.
Okay.
So our website, so we have blog posts, we have white papers that we've put up there, different kind of data insights we've gathered over the years. But you're right, we've been doing this kind of as long as anyone else in the game. We've I'm sure tested more samples than any other lab out there, and certainly we've over the years got really cool kind of data insights. We've helped customers solve kind of really interesting supply chain problems, sort of playing Sherlock Holmes, chasing back contaminants to odd and interesting kind of vectors. And certainly, like Jeff said early on, and it kind of gets into what we were talking about earlier in the podcast is, early on, when before there were any regulations to do any testing, we did a lot of consumer outreach, and we went directly to the consumer because we realized that if we educated the consumer about testing and quality in their cannabis, they would come into their dispensaries, who were our primary customers at the time, and they would demand tested product. And so we did, early on, kind of go directly to the consumer with information, and sort of as we've moved up the supply chain, in our testing, we do very little testing at the retail level now. It's almost all at the distributor and manufacturer levels. I think also a lot of the industry, including us, have probably lost sight, like you were saying, on talking to the consumer, because we're so concerned with trying to sell to the industry, our testing services, that we forget that the consumer is still really starving for information. And cannabis is a very complex plant. It's not just a recreational drug. We're comparing it to wine and other products right now, but I can't think of any other product that is used for kind of such a wide range of purposes. Everything from childhood epilepsy to some people that just want to have a good buzz on a Friday night. And so and all of that is valid, and all of that is necessary. And like a lot of people say, all use is medical use. I think the consumer of cannabis is still starving for information on such kind of a complex biodynamic plant.
That last comment that you made about all use, I've been saying that for years also, that even what we consider recreational use of cannabis or adult use cannabis, I think most of those people are coming to the table. They've chosen cannabis over wine or over liquor because they made a conscious decision that they are trying to solve some sort of an issue that they have, whether it be they don't want to have the same hangover, whether it want to be they want to get to sleep earlier, whether they want to be able to sleep better, they want to reduce their anxiety when they come home from work. All those things are medical issues, not just recreational issues. And so I agree with you. What do you guys think that if you had to pick one of the biggest issues that this industry still needs to address, what do you think it would be?
Social equity, taxation, right? I put those two together right at the top. Taxation in our industry is driving down business.
Well, it's also
Making
driving up the
making
black
business.
market.
Yeah, absolutely. And social equity is still. I mean, we have roots that go way back. We've seen the impact, and that's why again I mentioned earlier how it's a double-edged sword. We talk about the need for enforcement, but we've seen in the type of enforcement and what it does, and who is selected and who is close to the bullseye in that enforcement, and that's a scary prospect to me to want to bring that back or lean on that is something that's going to progress the industry. So, yeah, definitely very. We got a lot of work to do, right? Leave it at
What
that.
you guys say? You put your crystal ball in front of you for a second. When do you think that federally laws will start to change when it comes to cannabis? Because I think that as long as we have players in this industry doing silly ass shit like producing, THC 8 and O and trying to come up with the next O, I think that's going to keep pushing us out way further into the future because you literally give those who want a reason to hate.
Yeah, and you need the politics to line up. But I agree with you. Kind of all the funny business in the hemp industry and the only reason it exists is because the high THC cannabis is still illegal on the federal level. So people are taking hemp and trying to get around those laws and making all these products, so that way people can still get a buzz, but they're artificially produced. We don't know the risk profile the same way we know about the cannabinoids that are actually produced by cannabis. And so, I think it's just a time bomb waiting to happen. And it's only exists because we're still, we still have prohibition on THC. But yeah, I mean, we just had, that bill passed in the House, which is exciting.
Yeah,
But
it passed before in the House. I was going to tell you something.
Right.
I'm just so, I've got a lot of trepidation there. But,
yeah,
we did see something happen when it came to the next Supreme Court jurist, which surprised me because I didn't think that we would get any Republicans to go the right way and do the right thing. They have, and they will, and she will be confirmed. So maybe they'll surprise me when it comes to this bill.
and it doesn't seem like it's as partisan of an issue as some others. You do have some Republicans that are fans, and you have some Democrats that are against it. I mean, Joe Biden hasn't, certainly hasn't signaled that he's any fan of legalization either. So
Joe is contrary to what I think has been the popular belief that he was going to do something. Remember, they promised to do something in the first 100 days. He and Kamala Harris, didn't happen. And most people won't look at her record itself. There were more people incarcerated for minor cannabis crimes when
Right.
she was the AG than anybody before her. So and all this bullshit about I used once before, bullshit. So I call solid bullshit on that. So we don't have friends in the White House. They just want to be friends when it's time to be reelected. I'll guarantee you again, you'll see them jump up and down on a bandwagon, just like whoever the Republican is running for office will jump up and down on a bandwagon and say, yes, we're going to make some really good conscious moves forward. Shut the fuck up. I feel like saying to them, shut up, because it's not going to happen. But
Yeah.
and I think, guys like you, if you continue to do what you're doing, and that is trying to at least make this industry play by some standard, I think it'll help move the ball forward, no question. Anything else you
No,
want to add?
no, I mean, look, we got to continue to believe. I think there's what inspires me about being in the space for the last 12 years and being in cannabis for most of my life is that there are people who truly believe in the value of what we're doing, right? And not everybody has the benefit of working in an industry like that and contributing to an industry like that. So I'm incredibly thankful for that and hopeful. It makes me hopeful that at some point, I don't know, maybe it's an age thing. Maybe at a
Mhm.
certain point there are those people who were brought up believing in the that cannabis is something to be criminalized, no longer hold office. Maybe that's what it is, but it's coming, right?
Well, yeah, I mean, the one good thing is that, and I would say it's, I'm a little older than both of you. It's the baby boomers. I mean, when you stop and you think about it, I mean, the baby boomers were the ones that were the tail end of the marijuana movement, the cannabis movement back in the late '60s, early '70s. We were the younger brothers and sisters of the hardcore users, and you know, in most states around the country, it's the baby boomers who have now ascended to that position of authority in their local legislatures that are starting to say, "Well, shit, I did cannabis under the bleachers when I was in high school, and I didn't go to jail, so let's calm down a little bit." Now, but there are still some within that generation, my generation, that need to get out of here. So, I think when we see this generation get out of positions of authority, it'll be the next generation that will say, why have we been so stupid?
Yeah, and the same baby boomers too are now starting to get to an age where they're experiencing aches and pains. They're getting kind of some of those issues where cannabis can be really helpful. And so even the
Correct.
ones that weren't for it to start with, I've a lot of conservative family members back at home who I'm sure when I started doing this were were kind of looking at me kind of sideways, but now they're asking me questions and they're engaged, and I see that changing in my own life, and I can and I see it sort of more broadly and and also too, Montel, people like you that came out early on and said, "Hey, I smoke cannabis, and here's why," and spoke the truth, and people in our industry, scientists that are legitimate scientists that are looking at the data and not the kind of the stigma. I think it's been a slow movement, but we're trending in the right direction.
I think we'll trend even more in that right direction if we start educating the baby boomer. I mean, it's crazy. I'm sorry. I've been beating the drum, stomping up and down. We need to do, unfortunately, people don't understand. Yeah, I love my podcast and I love being able to work it, but there's not a lot of my age group watching podcasts. It's not. They're not a lot of them getting their information out of here. They're still getting their information off that television. And, unfortunately, state laws prohibit certain discussions about cannabis, especially from a marketing standpoint, but there's no reason why we should not be spending our money educating. Documentaries are well worth, as long as they're educational. You don't send anybody to a store to buy something. You can talk about cannabis, and we should be talking about it as much as we possibly can. But this industry is so bent on trying to keep somebody else from making a buck more than they make that we're going to end up fighting ourselves into the next 5 years and not see any movement at the federal level. But what I mean, I'm going to try to stay optimistic. Well, guys, look, I can't say thank you enough for you being a part of the show today. Give out your website again if people want to get more information.
It's sclabs.com.
sclabs.com. And you always have a home here if you want to come back and kick it a little bit. Especially, I think I've got a fairly informed viewership here at the Let's Be Blunt, and they really love to hear some of the scientific data. So I'd love to have you back again. We can chop it up a little bit more. Okay.
All right, we appreciate it. Thank you for having
Absolutely. I
us.
appreciate it. And thank you so much for what you guys are doing. I'm going to make sure that everybody knows that they need to make sure they tune in to this edition of Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Thanks for joining me on Let's Be Blunt with Montel. Please make sure you're subscribed and hit the bell to be notified when new episodes post each week. We'd love to hear your feedback also, so please send us your comments.